I briefly wanted to give y'all a history on the conversation of human trafficking in Texas. In 2001, Texas was one of the first states to pass anti-human trafficking laws, and right there with Washington State. And at first, we were talking about human trafficking, and we were trying to clarify what human trafficking was versus smuggling. If we had our way, we would take trafficking out of the conversation, because you don't need to be in a van and drive for modern day slavery to be happening. And then a couple of years later, in 2007, we really started talking about U.S. citizens being victims of human trafficking, domestic minor sex trafficking, and you could just tell that public officials were scratching their head, and what are you talking about? You know, you're talking about prostitutes. It's illegal, you know, for people to go and act and this kind of activity to happen. And we were very clear that there was huge inconsistencies in our state laws. On one hand, you're saying that minors cannot consent to sex, and on the other hand, you're saying, well, if there's consent and money was exchanged, then they're a criminal. And it kind of captured their attention, but nobody really knew what to do about it. And so in 2009, we had some huge victories around human trafficking. The state legislature realized that there was a problem. We don't know what to do about it, so let's create some task force, right? So there were two wins in this area. One was that there was a committee that was created to study the alternatives to the juvenile justice system. And then there was also the Attorney General's task force, prevention task force on human trafficking. And the AG's task force was really important for Texas. Human trafficking is so organized and so mobile that no one could wrap their hands around it. There was no one point of contact, there was no strategy, there was no communication, and so these rings would go to Houston, to Dallas, to San Antonio, to Austin, and we're always one step ahead. And so when we had the AG's task force, it was huge. We had some experts. It really brought in people from different sectors, law enforcement, nonprofits, the courts, organizations, together to talk about this. And one huge win right off the bat was right before the Super Bowl in Dallas. I was talking to the AG's office, and there were a lot of grassroots organizations in Dallas raising awareness about human trafficking, right? It's on demand. Human trafficking follows sports events, follows conventions. So they took it upon themselves to be very organized, and we're having conversations. And when I was talking to the AG's office, they had just gotten off the phone with the law enforcement in Florida saying, what are your people doing over there? Our pimp blogs are going crazy, saying stay away from this intersection, stay away from, you know, the other intersection, because they were following what was going on in Houston or in Dallas. And so it was really critical that the AG's office and law enforcement could step in there, and that we had that point of contact. So after that, there were several reports, and Anne has referred to those reports, and there were recommendations, and that had been in 2009. In 2010, we got the opinion of the Supreme Court, so we just absolutely thought that we were set up for 2011. We are going to conquer domestic minor sex trafficking because we have this case, and we have this task force with all these recommendations. And then, very clearly, as y'all know, there was a loud message saying, Texas has no money, don't ask for it. And so where were the social services going to come in? So we were honing in on where are our big wins. And when the ruling came from the Supreme Court case, it was like, yay, they're not victims, no longer, they're not criminals, no longer can we treat the youth as victims. But then advocates had to stop, and yay, we can celebrate for a second, but that ruling had to do with youth under the age of 14. So very quickly we had to ask ourselves about, what about the 14-year-olds, what about the 15-year-olds, what about the 16-year-olds, and what do we do? And since the court, or since law enforcement can no longer criminalize these youth under the age of 14, where do they go and how do the referrals happen? So the Texas legislature decided to focus on these questions, but also went after enhancement penalties. We also went after third-party liability, looking at things that didn't cost a lot of money, but things that could end demand. And so no longer can hotels and motels turn their head and not be held accountable for this activity. We made great headway in regards to removing force, fraud, and coercion for minors. No longer do we have to prove that, so it's easier for prosecutors and defense attorneys when dealing with minors. And then also the legislature passed a law that allowed for restitution and rehabilitation at the discretion of the court so that minors could get the services that they really needed. And this was a huge win. Now it's our job to educate the judges and the courts on that this is available. So please, at your discretion, mandate this restitution. This year, a couple of months ago, Texas opened up the first safe house with 30 beds. This was huge. We know that there are several victims of human trafficking and there are less than 100 beds nationwide. So the fact that Texas has 30 beds now is a huge win, along with the girls' court that was just established in Houston. We are really creating this framework and resources for youth to be able to get the services that they need. So that's what has happened. And now looking at 2013, we have 6 months before the Texas legislature convenes again, and advocates are coming together saying, what are our next steps? What are we going to be asking for? And I think that Ann did an excellent job of laying out what has happened, but what needs to be done. And it's all about interpretation. The Supreme Court laid out a great model and a great framework, and it is up to the Texas legislature to follow through. When we look at when we look at human trafficking, it's very similar to domestic violence. There are protocols in place and how victims should be treated, right? Law enforcement can no longer walk away. There's protocols and laws that must be taken in order for youth to be served and for them to be rehabilitated. There's still this huge conversation on what is the role of CPS and what is the role of law enforcement, who has jurisdiction, who has custody of these children, of these minors at 14, 15, 13, 16 years of age. And so those conversations are happening right now. What is needed, what advocates are asking for, is for safe harbor laws to be in place so that we have a network of best practices of how we treat these victims when they come in custody, be it through CPS or law enforcement, that we know that there is a network that is established for these youth. We also need to start focusing on runaways, the prevention of human trafficking. Ann said 1 out of 3 runaways who are lured into 1 out of 3 runaways are lured into prostitution within 48 hours. That's long enough for them to get hungry or tired looking for a bed. That's long enough for them to end up at a bus stop and be preyed upon and lured into the situation. So how can law enforcement and social service providers really get a grasp on these runaways and what services and what policies need to be in place to protect them from becoming victims of human trafficking? And now that we have a safe house, we need to really look at the laws and policies and procedures of what can the Texas legislature do, what funding streams need to be in place so that youth can go to these safe houses and be rehabilitated at the same time. And so Children at Risk is currently looking at best practices at safe houses, and that'll be out in September. I know Dawn on our staff is going to DC, and we'll be sharing this information with some stakeholders over there.